Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace, FMEP. I'm Peter Beinart, non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is Wednesday, Thursday, sorry, December 12th, 2024. I'm happy to be here with William Shoki. William is Cape Town, South African-based writer and editor of the online magazine and archive Africa is a Country. William also hosts the Africa is a Country podcast, which offers analysis of current events, culture, and sports on the African continent and its diaspora from the left. And I was really been a follower and admirer of William's work and was really keen to talk to him about the way the Israel's war and destruction of Gaza is playing in South Africa and why it is that South Africa has chosen to play such a prominent role on this issue on the global stage. So William, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me on, Peter, and the feeling of admiration is mutual.
Thank you. So I guess I wanted to start with a broad question. It seems that the question of the Palestinian struggle resonates in a particular way in South Africa. And I wonder if you can just talk about why that is.
So I think that is the case for a lot of reasons. I think the way we typically understand this is, on the one level, that South Africans feel an organic affinity with the plight of Palestinians. Our own experience of apartheid and rule under a white supremacist regime means that South Africans, I think, can, in a very often spontaneous and quick and easy way, see the ways in which that experience is replicated in Israel and Palestine. I think that's the one part of it. I think the other part of it is related, but is somewhat distinct in a subtle way, which is that it's not only a matter of South Africans feeling an affinity for Palestinians and their cause for self-determination, but also being reminded by their own oppression under the apartheid government. And to be more specific, what I mean here is that South Africans see the ways in which the State of Israel was created in 1948, which is the same year that the apartheid regime was legally sanctioned. And they see its history and trajectory and the contemporary moment as not being dissimilar from the apartheid government itself, down to the way that religion is weaponized to justify domination and control, the way some people talk of Israel as this outpost of European civilization in a hostile environment of darker races, the ways in which it's supported and buttressed by the Western world, much like the apartheid government was. So I think that there's a sense in which people identify and express solidarity to Palestinians, but I think there's also a way in which South Africans see the Israeli state and they're reminded of the apartheid state, and so feel a responsibility to resist to resist that and hold it accountable.
Hmm. And this affinity obviously doesn't just start with when apartheid in South Africa ends, right? I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the history of the relationship between the African National Congress and other Black South African kind of freedom movements and how they related to the Palestinian struggle.
So the African National Congress maintained close relationships with anti-colonial movements and organizations, not only in Southern Africa, primarily in Mozambique and Angola, but across the continent, as well as with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That relationship began in the 1970s. And I think that kind of relationship is well documented. But I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to kind of return to the earlier point that I was being made, is that at the same time as there was this close relationship between the African National Congress and other national liberation movements, both on the continent and internationally, think Cuba, think its relationship with sort of the communist East, particularly Soviet Russia and other places, there was also a close relationship between the apartheid South African government and
Right.
the Israeli government. So the Israeli government, was the biggest exporter of arms to the apartheid government in the 1980s, defying United Nations imposed arms embargo. There was a close relationship between the president at the time, P.W. Botha, and Israeli defense minister at the time, Shimon Peres, and lots of examples of this close political, ideological, and security relationship. So I think it cuts both ways, and that's the important thing to understand, right? Is that it's not only a matter of identifying with the Palestinian cause, but it's also seeing the similarity in the way the oppression happens and in the source of that oppression, and that dates before post-apartheid South Africa, but even during apartheid as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the South African government's decision to bring this case of genocide at the International Court of Justice, I'm curious how you think that plays in to South Africa's larger vision of how it relates in what its role in the world is politically. Surely, obviously, the South African government knew that when it did this, it was going to put it into conflict with the United States and some other governments in the West. But I'm curious how you think it fits into South African foreign policy more generally.
Yeah, I think South Africa, since the fall of apartheid, has always enjoyed a kind of international goodwill where I think a lot of people looked at the South African anti-apartheid struggle and the way apartheid was dismantled as a watershed of the triumph of human rights and equality against the forces of domination and oppression. And of course, Nelson Mandela is the iconic representative and figure of this history. And I think after the demise of apartheid, I think South Africa entered the international state system and wanted to play this role of being a state that defends human rights, that tries to hold the powerful accountable, and that positions itself as a kind of normative superpower. I think this was especially the case considering that after the end of apartheid, South Africa sort of was thrust into the international arena, integrated into global capitalism, and the African National Congress didn't really have, at least domestically, much freedom to chart its political and economic trajectory, or at least not as much room as it wanted to, and it found itself sort of pressured by the constraints of global capital. And so foreign policy then became this vehicle to try and assert its political identity and moral framework in a way that it really couldn't domestically. And so I think that its initiative at the International Court of Justice forms part of this long tradition where South Africa tries to exert its influence and weight as a kind of normative superpower. Whether that is something that has been principally consistent is a different question, right? People rightfully sort of are puzzled by South Africa's position vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, for example, and other places. But I think for the most part, this is the way it imagines the role that it could play as sort of the custodian of a non-aligned vision in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I'm curious to elaborate on that a little bit. So for folks who would say, well, the human rights concerns that South Africa is expressing when it comes to Palestinians, it's not expressing vis-a-vis Ukrainians. Do you think that the discourse in the South African government puts Russia and Ukraine in a kind of a different basket or a different bucket? And again, why would that? Obviously, in the West, you often find that there's much more sympathy for Ukrainians than there is for Palestinians for a set of political reasons. Why in the South African case is it sometimes the opposite?
I think the reason the ANC distinguishes Ukraine from Palestine is about what Ukraine represents in the international arena. And I think the South African government sees the way that Ukraine itself is sort of mobilized for its own sort of effort to consolidate its hegemony against the rise of other powers such as Russia, and feels as if Ukraine is kind of being deployed as a pawn in a game to defend and consolidate American hegemony, and identifies a lot of the source of the world's problems as originating in American hegemony, and seeing American hegemony as a kind of neocolonial instantiation of geopolitical power. It wouldn't go so far as to say that explicitly, but that's kind of what is implied. And of course, the South African government has to balance that worldview with the fact that it still tries to maintain a close, particularly economic relationship with the United States. So I think because it sees Ukraine as representing that, it doesn't easily identify with the Ukrainian struggle and with its defense of its sovereignty, because it feels as if the way the West has come out in support of Ukraine reflects hypocrisy, reflects a double standard, where on the one hand, it wants to make all of these points about respecting Ukrainian self-determination and sovereignty and combating Russian aggression, where in other instances, most notably Israel-Palestine, it's silent. So I think South Africa, not just South Africa, but a lot of countries in the global South are simply unprepared to be a part of that. They feel as if it's a double standard, and so they'd much prefer an approach that appears neutral. And I think it sees then Palestine as kind of the linchpin in this ongoing and incomplete anti-colonial struggle, where, as I said earlier, sort of Palestine and Palestinians are defending their rights against this aggressive state that is being directly financed and propped up by the United States and its allies. And so it's a classic sort of interpretation of political struggle, where Palestine is, in the South African understanding, the little guy, and Israel is the big guys with very strong friends. And Ukraine could have, there was a window where the Ukrainian struggle against Russia could have been read in similar terms, but the way in which the West has deployed the Ukrainian struggle for its own ends means that it becomes indistinguishable from that geopolitical project.
So South Africa's international actions as relates to Gaza are also taking place in a political context in South Africa, in which the ANC has been the dominant party since the end of apartheid, but has faced more challenges and has seen its share of the vote go down. It faces challengers from a kind of from the left, from people who feel like South Africa hasn't transformed enough, but also from people who kind of have a more neoliberal economic perspective of the Democratic Party. I'm curious, how do you think South Africa's international moves vis-a-vis Gaza relate to its political domestic kind of challenges?
To be honest, Peter, it's a question I haven't fully figured out for myself, because I think it's, there's the obvious sort of contradiction or tension, which is, on the one hand, South Africa projects itself as this moral leader in geopolitics in the way that it's defended Palestinian rights and in the way that it's tried to hold Israel account in the International Court of Justice. But domestically, its record has been less than inspiring. It came to power with many high hopes in 1994, but since then, its political rule has been associated with debilitating corruption, eroding state capacity, neoliberal economic policy that has worsened South African inequality, and that inequality is still heavily racialized. And so a lot of people, South Africans and outsiders, look at the economic and political landscape in the country and feel as if apartheid has ended formally, but substantively, its legacy still looms large, and the ANC has failed to correct that. So I think that's a tension that it's hard to pass out exactly what to make of it, and exactly what to make of the fact that ANC political officials, not across the board, but at least certainly some, still seem to, in their foreign policy and the way they project South Africa on the international stage, I think genuinely tap into the best traditions of the African National Congress of emphasizing this humanism, this vision of equality between states and within states. But that, of course, is undermined by the fact that domestically it hasn't really been able to achieve that. And so I think it's going to be a question for historians to first of all try and figure out exactly how this political organization has these radically different expressions. And to figure out, I think part of the answer is that the ANC, in a sense, is compensating for its failure domestically. It is trying to recover a sense of its own identity because it's an organization that is a shadow of its former self. It's no longer this party that is associated with liberation and emancipation by South Africans. So it can at least try to salvage some semblance of that on the international stage.
Right.
How that's being received domestically, I think there's been mixed feelings. I think a lot of South Africans are in this awkward position where they are happy with the way the ANC has positioned itself and the government internationally, but are still enormously disillusioned with its record at home.
So in the global debate about Israel and Palestine, as the prospects of partition have receded, there has been a lot of talk about looking to South Africa as a model for one future equal, at least equally equal under the law, kind of Palestine-Israel. I'm curious what that discourse is like in South Africa itself, given that, as you were saying, the South Africa style solution in South Africa itself has actually not met many people's hopes.
I think that discourse is muted. I think there was a time when it probably captured the consensus among South Africans. The ANC's official position, because it's mirroring kind of the international consensus as well, was largely in favor of partition. But people would tell you, privately that, most South Africans naturally gravitated to a vision of a unitary, secular, democratic state, where Palestinians and Israeli Jews could live side by side with equal rights. But to be frank, I think October 7 has shattered hopes in that for many South Africans. And I think South Africans themselves are confronting two things. One, they're confronting the limits of apartheid as an adequate framework to understand the Israeli and Palestinian experience. And because of that, they're confronting, two, the prescription of a South African styled resolution as the appropriate course of action. I think October 7 and its aftermath has simply kind of blown any hopes for that out of the water. Because I think, you talk to a lot of South Africans who see the visuals coming out of Gaza, and a lot of people think it's possibly worse. It's worse than what the majority of Black South Africans experience under apartheid. And I'm not going to sit here and say whether I believe that's true, but I think that sentiment is palpable and it's there. And so I think a lot of South Africans are now interested in disanalogizing Africa and Palestine and trying to find frameworks that can give us a language to understand Israel-Palestine on its own terms, because I think there is scope in the future for whatever resolution to borrow from the South African experience. But the South African experience, as you've rightfully acknowledged, also shows us the ways in which that resolution has also been inadequate, in repairing the injustice that apartheid and colonialism preceding that caused, and in achieving substantive material equality for all South Africans.
Yeah. You mentioned October 7th. I'm curious what the discourse has been like in South Africa around October 7th and around Hamas. Obviously the ANC did use armed resistance, but there was not a kind of October 7th like moment in the anti-apartheid struggle. And also the Hamas has a kind of religious ideology that distinguishes it from the ANC. And so I'm curious, how do people, again, think, what is the South African discourse about armed resistance that in this case targeted civilians, and also about the nature of Hamas as a religious organization? What's the South African kind of conversation about that?
It's a conflicted conversation. I don't think that there's a consensus view. I think South Africans come at it from different angles. There are some who support Hamas's actions and liken it to the armed struggle of the ANC, and there are others who disagree with that view and think that Hamas went a step too far, whether that's on moral grounds or political pragmatic grounds, whatever the case might be. But I think this conversation, and this relates to what I was saying earlier, this conversation, I think, in the process of its unfolding, has only illuminated, I think, to a lot of South Africans, the extent to which the South African anti-apartheid struggle and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, the ways in which they might differ fundamentally. And I think, one way in which the experience of the ANC, I think, shows that is that Palestinian civil and political society has been so thoroughly fragmented, right? It's experienced a level of social dislocation and disintegration by design that I think you didn't have in South Africa. And South Africa, for a lot of reasons, I think one important one that needs to be emphasized in every conversation is the fact that the nature of apartheid was such that it wanted to keep Black South Africans involved and present in the polity so as to extract their labor, so as to prop up the lifestyle and leisure of white South Africans. And so the strategic economic positions that Black South Africans occupied means that you had an anti-apartheid movement that was deeply rooted in a strong labor movement, and you had
Right.
sort of
Which had
labor.
real power, right?
There was real power. There was real power, but South Africans were also one, because they weren't uprooted and they were still in their original communities, and two, because they encountered each other in the economic sphere. They were encountering each other in places where they were able to really kind of build a national consciousness that superseded sort of tribal affiliation or religious identity and so on and so forth, that was able to sort of culminate in the kind of mass democratic movements that you saw the ANC being the figure of in the 1980s, with many of other movements represented, but the ANC was able to kind of arise to this position of leadership. And you have all of these economic, political, and social conditions that were able to produce a trajectory that feels currently at least impossible in Palestine. So I think the feeling of a lot of South Africans is this debate was lively, at least in the aftermath of October 7, but I think a lot of South Africans now are in a position where, frankly, they kind of just want to take the back seat, because we've often theorized from our own standpoint, our own experience, but now we're encountering the limits of that in really striking ways.
Yeah. One thing that's happened, in recent months that's come to the fore in a lot of international discussions is the way in which Israel, in the wake of October 7th, has now expanded its wars, beyond Israel-Palestine into Lebanon, and now is doing all of this bombing in Syria. And I'm curious what you think there might be to learn, if anything, from South Africa's relationships with the African countries on its borders because I think this is a history that most Americans don't know very well, that there was actually a lot of military intervention by the apartheid government, in partly justified by the claims that there was, these countries were harboring ANC fighters. I'm curious how you think we might look at Israel's actions in Lebanon and Syria against that backdrop.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And some of that history is that the South African government sort of was heavily involved in frontline states in Southern Africa, particularly Angola, Namibia, and Mozambique, sort of militarily supporting quote unquote anti-communist forces, which they saw as aiding and abetting the anti-apartheid movement, and in some cases, particularly Angola, actually sending white South African soldiers to fight. And I think it's a lot of people have sort of thought back to that history and seen that as sort of the final gasps of the apartheid South African state, because all of these military entanglements intensified in the 1980s, and it wasn't long before apartheid was being dismantled and South Africa entered a post-apartheid and democratic future. And I understand that impulse, but frankly, Peter, and I think this is my main feeling, and I think a feeling a lot of South Africans shared. It's hard to interpret Israel's own aggression in the region currently as indicating a similar point in its historical timeline. What I mean by that is that it's hard to say that, the future will unfold in that linear fashion, where this is the signals that the Israeli state is losing power. I think in one significant way, it is losing power in the sense that it's, at least amongst ordinary publics, it's being subject to fierce condemnation. People are holding it accountable. It's no longer a swear word to call it an apartheid state. In fact, terms such as settler colonial and genocide and so on are increasingly normalized. But I think the significant difference is that by the time the apartheid government was throwing all of this military intervention at the wall and seeing what stuck, it was losing international support. It was losing the support of the United States, the United Kingdom, and major international powers that had backed it at that point, up until that point. And I'm not sure that dynamic is necessarily true of Israel. So it's hard to read that history and extract lessons from it, because I don't think that it's the same trajectory and the geopolitical conditions are the same. I think certainly it indicates that the state of Israel feels fragile, that it feels as if it cannot defend its political project without a show of force and aggression in the region. But in other ways, that's kind of been continuous with the history of the state, at least since 1967, more acutely. So I'm not really sure if there are any clear lessons to extract from that.
Yeah, I'm also just curious about the way in which the way in which the domestic South African debate about Israel-Palestine is racialized at all. Obviously, Israel, on the one hand, Israel has there's been a global shift, I think, of public opinion of greater sympathy for Palestinians, but there are these big pockets all over the place in the world of people who very strongly identify for their own reasons with the Israeli project. And I'm curious, what is the discourse among white South Africans like about Israel? I mean, historically, as you were mentioning, there was a very strong association among Afrikaner and other white South Africans with Israel as a kind of fellow project. Is that still exist, or is that basically no longer a discourse that's possible in post-apartheid South Africa?
I think it exists in pockets, but I think it's not a highly visible discourse. There's even, not all Afrikaners, of course, but there's some Afrikaners who go to Israel sort of as an act of nostalgia for the apartheid state, and who try to make a life there. But I think it's a discourse that largely kind of, if we think at least at the level of organized politics, the Democratic Alliance, which is the official opposition, which is currently in a coalition with the Anti-African National Congress, has been the party that has traditionally, quote unquote, sided with Israel. But even its position has kind of sort of moderated over the last 2 years, I'd say. It's kind of always repeats the international consensus on a two-state solution, and recognizing Palestinian rights, but also recognizing Israeli security concerns and so on and so forth. So it's a discourse that is still there, but I would say it's not visible. I think, to be frank, the Israel-Palestine discourse in South Africa is something that has a lot of visibility in the mainstream media, and in civil society and in organized politics. But the thing to remember about South Africa is that it's also a very big country. And I think that the majority of South Africans are not tuned in. You know, it's an issue which, once you describe its basic contours to Black South Africans especially, there is that natural affinity, but it's not front of mind because, you know, South Africans are facing their own problems. It's a country with such vast unemployment, inequality, poverty, etc. So it's not an issue that I think is at the forefront of most South Africans' minds. And then I think most white South Africans are largely kind of indifferent or apathetic. So I think it's a discourse which, if anyone is involved, it still captures sort of the sphere of organized politics, of political society. And yeah, I mean, not just at the party political level, but at the level of organized labor, social and civic movements. And I'd say it's there's obviously some reach into the public, and people kind of identify organically with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination there. But as far as the discourse and who's driving the conversation, I'd say it's largely confined to that demographic of society.
Yeah. One last question. I mean, it's easy when one thinks back about the global conditions under which apartheid fell. It was during this third wave of democratization. So you were having countries moving towards democracy. It was also after the fall of the Soviet Union. So a kind of a moment of a really high point of kind of neoliberal economic consensus. And maybe in some ways, both of those things facilitated the end of apartheid. The ANC couldn't really redistribute wealth once there was no longer Soviet Union anymore. And also this move of falling of authoritarian regimes was something that was happening all over the world. Israel-Palestine now, this moment is in a very, very different kind of moment, right? In which basically authoritarianism is rising. We're not in unipolar order. And arguably, neoliberalism or global capitalism is shifting as there's more protectionism and more fragmentation. I'm just curious if you have thoughts. This is a very, very big question, so just take it wherever you want. But I'm just curious if you have thoughts about the very different global moment that we're in might how we think about that as a factor in terms of why the South African trajectory doesn't seem at this moment like it seems very likely in Palestine and Israel.
Gosh, I don't know if I can say anything other than to echo what you've just said, which is that I think that the political and geopolitical conditions now are extremely adverse to any kind of upsurge of anti-apartheid organizing in Palestine and in support from international powers for that process. So it's very hard to predict or to even try and pass out what might be the trajectory of this struggle. I think that, you know, the one thing that remains true of both historical moments is that both the South African anti-apartheid struggle and now the Palestinian struggle for national liberation has raised global consciousness, and there's now, I think, pretty widespread support for the Palestinian struggle. But it's hard to know what the upshot of that is without kind of any serious movement on the part of major powers to hold Israel accountable. You know, as long as the United States is financing the Israeli state and supplying it with arms, there's very little reason to believe that things will change, not least with Trump at the White House. I think the one thing, though, that it does make clear is the fact that kind of really the only real way out of the morass is if we see a period of heightened international solidarity, if there's really kind of movements, especially at the coalface of empire, you know, in the United States, in Europe, if there are movements that try to impose political costs on these states so that they do hold Israel accountable, and if there's heightened political organizing and activity in Israel-Palestine itself, right? And I think it's hard to see where that goes and what that might consist in. because the terrain itself is also unfavorable. But I think that's the only way to imagine any way out of this is if we see those two things develop, a kind of rejuvenated Palestinian national struggle, rejuvenated Israeli opposition to the Israeli government, and heightened international solidarity. Those are kind of the only ways in which you can imagine a world where sufficient political costs are imposed on people that wield political power and decision-making power to move in a different direction.
Thank you, William. This was really, really great. I really appreciate you joining me. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, resources related to this podcast, and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.